Great. All right. Well, yeah. My name is Brandon Sowers. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a member of Esperanto-USA, and I'll be presenting in English tonight, just to make it as accessible as possible. But I would love to give this presentation again sometime in Esperanto. I'll be talking about connections between the well-known American author Upton Sinclair and Esperanto. Along the way, I'm also going to discuss an interesting Esperantist who I discovered while researching Sinclair, whose name is Parley Parker Christensen, or as I have nicknamed him, La Presidunto. So for Upton Sinclair, a lot more people have heard of him than have read him, and that's even more true of Sinclair than it is for a lot of authors. So his best known work is The Jungle, which came out in 1906. And that was about the meatpacking industry in Chicago. It's something that a lot of us have at least seen in high school, if not read it. Sinclair wrote The Jungle to talk about the horrible working conditions in the meatpacking industry in Chicago. But he found that the public was much more appalled by the condition of the meat than the condition of their meat workers. Or as Sinclair later put it, he aimed for the public's heart and he hit it in the stomach. This launched Sinclair to fame. And after that, he maintained a very productive output of literature, even if the literary value of it may not have always been particularly high. He wrote hundreds of novels as well as nonfiction books. He corresponded regularly, for example, with the then American president, Theodore Roosevelt. And he had a very interesting political career after he became famous as an author. Which culminated in 1934 when he came very close to becoming governor of California, which is a topic that I'll come back to. In 1943, he received the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. But despite this very interesting career, today he's basically just known as the author of The Jungle, although there has been a bit of a Sinclair revival in the last couple of years, which is another topic that I'll return to. So, what's the connection between Upton Sinclair and Esperanto? I started researching this connection after reading Esperanto in the New York Times, which was edited by Ulrich Becker. It came out a few years ago. It covers every mention of Esperanto in the New York Times between 1887 to 1922. There's two articles that mention Sinclair, being friends with Esperantists, addressing Esperantist meetings. In one of them, Sinclair basically says, "My Esperanto is bad," which implies that he at least had started to learn Esperanto or had some familiarity with it, although he may have also been joking and saying that he didn't speak any Esperanto. Now, as I mentioned, Sinclair has had a bit of a revival in the last couple of years. So I'll talk a little bit about that. It's something that in a certain way I'm participating in right now. I think it began in 2006 with a satirical novel called Us or US by Chris Bachelder, which could be read as being Upton Sinclair's initials or the name of our country, the USA. And in this novel, it's a satirical novel where Upton Sinclair keeps being literally brought back to life by kind of naive American leftists who are all hoping that he'll be kind of the magic solution that will help popularize their ideas in the US. And it never quite works. They bring him back to life and he just starts writing new novels and going around the country having adventures. However, Chris Bachelder seems to have predicted a minor uptick of uses of Upton Sinclair in popular culture. The very next year, in 2007, Sinclair's novel Oil, with an exclamation point, was adapted into the Coen brothers film There Will Be Blood. Then a couple of years later, about 12 years later, in 2019, several people started to notice similarities between Upton Sinclair's gubernatorial run in California in 1934 and the Bernie Sanders campaign for president in 2019-2020. So you can see here there's an issue of a magazine called Jacobin, where they've taken an old Upton Sinclair book, I, Governor of California and How I Beat Poverty, and they've adapted it for the Bernie Sanders campaign. This topic, the 1934 governor run of Upton Sinclair, has itself been brought into popular culture through the 2020 film Mank, where that gubernatorial run is an important part of the plot of Mank. And in fact, Upton Sinclair makes a cameo played by Bill Nye. You could even say that Bill Nye has his own revival of Upton Sinclair in the film. So, as you can see, in the last decade and a half, Upton Sinclair keeps being brought back to life by people using him for different purposes, and I'm going to bring him back to life for Esperanto. So, what exactly did Upton Sinclair say about Esperanto, or in relation to Esperanto? As I mentioned, there's two mentions about him in the New York Times articles prior to 1922. Both are from 1911. So one was when an Esperantist named Donald Stevens was late to an Esperanto event because he'd been playing baseball with Sinclair on a Sunday, which was illegal in Delaware. So they were both arrested and held for several hours, which caused Donald Stevens to be late to the meeting. The other mention, also in 1911, is when the the Esperanto Club of Arden, Delaware, invited Upton to speak to the club, and Sinclair said, "I'm sorry, my Esperanto is bad." Now, this is interesting. Sinclair was living in Arden, Delaware. Specifically, Arden was kind of an artist or utopian colony in Delaware. He was living there with Donald Stevens, and it appears that they were friends, and that Donald exposed Sinclair to Esperanto. One thing that was not mentioned in the New York Times, but is mentioned in the America Esperantisto of July 1910, is that Sinclair also spoke to the Esperanto Club of Arden, Delaware, during a speaking tour around the country to build up publicity for Esperanto prior to the 6th Universala Congreso that would happen in Washington, D.C. that year. And during the meeting where Esperanto was being promoted in Arden, Sinclair apparently swore on the American Esperanto book that he would learn Esperanto in time to participate in the 6th Universala Congreso. Unfortunately, I haven't found any other mention of Sinclair, whether or not he went to that Universala Congreso. It would be extremely interesting if I can find, a confirmation that he was at that UCO. But I certainly thought it was interesting that he, swore he would learn Esperanto in time to participate. One other just weird aside and a reminder of what a small world we live in. This tiny town of Arden, Delaware has had at least one other famous resident, which is our current president of the US, Joseph Biden. So beyond Sinclair on Esperanto, what about Sinclair in Esperanto? I haven't found yet any kind of direct mention of Sinclair referring to Esperanto after 1911 until much later, and I'm going to come back to that. But he has had at least 3 of his novels translated into Esperanto. So those are Jimmy Higgins, Oil, and The Gnome-Mobile. Of these 3, only Oil is really well known today because it was adapted into the Coen Brothers film. Although The Gnome-Mobile was also adapted into a Disney film in the 70s. And then Jimmy Higgins was published by Senascienza Asocio Tutmonda in 1934, during the same time that Sinclair was running for governor of California. Presumably, there was some kind of contact between the publishers and translators and Sinclair, although that's going to require more, searching for archives to see that direct contact. But I imagine there was contact, as they were translating his novels and publishing them. Now, having 3 novels translated into Esperanto probably puts Sinclair in the very top tier of American authors who've been translated into Esperanto. I doubt that there's many American authors who've had more than 3 novels translated into Esperanto. So he is one of the most well-represented American authors in Esperanto. Although it doesn't directly relate to Esperanto, I want to mention his EPIC movement and his run for governor of California. So EPIC stands for End Poverty in California, and it was a broad movement that Sinclair was kind of the head of while he was running for governor, but there were many other people running for office. Some of them are quite interesting. So, for example, Robert Heinlein was associated with Epic, and he ran up in so many debts during the campaign that then he had to start writing science fiction to pay off his debts, and then became the science fiction author that we all know today. However, one particularly interesting character came up to me while I was researching Sinclair's career and Epic, and this was someone named Parley Parker Christensen, who won election to the Los Angeles City Council as part of Epic. And in the Wikipedia entry for Epic, Christensen was mentioned as a footnote, just saying, yeah, he won election to the LA City Council, and he was an Esperantist. So when I saw that, I thought, okay, there's something interesting going on there. So I looked into this guy a little bit, and the more I looked into him, the more interesting he was. So I'm gonna make a brief interlude through the life and career of Parley Parker Christensen, and then I'll return to Upton Sinclair. So Christensen, as I mentioned, he was elected to the LA City Council. That happened in 1935. He stayed until 1949 with just a short pause where he was not in office. He had some interesting ideas on the city council. For example, in 1936, he tried to prevent LA from sending the flag of the 1932 Olympics to Berlin, then in Nazi Germany, which was going to be the host of the 1936 Olympics. He wanted the LA City Council to try to prevent the Olympic flag from being sent over. He seemed to be a very striking figure while in office, and I think probably throughout his life. So one mention I found of his time in office is from Stuart Timmins, who was one of the two authors of a book called Gay LA, about the history of gay and queer people in Los Angeles, describing an area called Bunker Hill that was a kind of a bohemian and gay-friendly area. And he wrote that the area, quote, even had its own radical politician, a, quote, flamboyant character down to his flowing locks and fluency in Esperanto, referring to Parley Parker Christensen. Timmins, as well as many other people, also always took note of Christensen being about 6'4" and always wearing a neatly pressed white linen suit. So he seems like quite a character. Now, just prior to his election to the LA City Council, Christensen was very involved in both the local Los Angeles and the national Esperanto movement. In 1931 and 32, he was the vice president of the Esperanto-USA de Norte-Americo, which is the predecessor to ELNA, which is now Esperanto-USA. While he was vice president of EANA, he was also giving a Herculean amount of Esperanto classes in the LA area. So it's probably thousands of people who attended his classes. And to give one example, I found the mention of one at a automotive and electrical school that had 125 attendees. So he was giving classes kind of all over the place, upper crust society, auto mechanics, and people were getting very excited about his classes. It seems that one of the draws for his classes was that he was able to also lecture on his extensive world travels using Esperanto. So that's what he was up to in the early 30s. But what about his travels? What had he done prior to that? And what was he lecturing on in the early 30s? So I've started jokingly and lovingly I've started referring to Christensen as La Presidunto, which in Esperanto means the would-be president, because the main actual historical notice of him, aside from Esperantists, is that he ran for president in 1922 on the ticket of a newly formed party called the Farmer Labor Party. So this is the main thing that anybody remembers him for outside of Esperanto. No, they didn't do very good in the 1920 election. He got about 1% of the vote, which was fourth place behind, of course, the Democrats and Republicans, as well as the Socialist Party at the time. Although he did get about 20% in Washington and South Dakota. I will say that, even with getting 1% of the vote, that probably makes him the most successful Esperantist to ever run for the U.S. presidency. Now, before he ran, he was fairly unknown. He'd been a lawyer in Utah, which is where he was from, and he'd been in the Utah state legislature a couple of times. He had been a district attorney. He was a fairly conventional figure at that time, and tended towards what was seen as kind of a progressive republicanism, in the vein of Theodore Roosevelt. However, during World War I, he defended, as a lawyer, he defended some labor activists and kind of grew closer to the labor movement. So then he shows up in 1919 in Chicago at the convention of a group called the 48ers, who were trying to start a new kind of liberal political party. He ends up as the chairman of their convention, and apparently he's really, really good at chairing conventions. I found several mentions of him being a very skilled parliamentarian and chair of conventions. So he's at the convention of the 48ers, and they decide to dissolve their convention and go across town because there's another convention happening to set up a labor party, and they decide to join forces with the Labor Party. So they go into that convention, and it's being badly chaired, and they put forward Mr. Christensen as their candidate for chair of the convention. He's accepted as chair, doing a great job. And the convention goes well, except they can't find anybody to run for president, to be their candidate for president. Most of the possible people are too tied into existing kind of factions of the labor movement, and nobody wants someone who's too tied to one faction and not to another. So finally, they settle on the guy who's been chairing the convention. He's from Utah, which is a state that doesn't have a strong labor movement. He's a lawyer, so he's not really tied with any existing union or anything like that. And he's doing a good job chairing the convention. So they decide to have Parley Parker Christensen run for president, apparently because he was basically unknown prior to that. Now, he ran in 1920. As I said, he lost quite badly. And afterwards, he decided to go across the world using Esperanto. So I haven't found any mention of when he learned Esperanto, but he did begin a 3-year around-the-world trip in 1920 using Esperanto, which to me implies he must have already spoken Esperanto before he ran for president. During that first 3-year round-the-world trip, among other things, he apparently had an interview with Vladimir Lenin while he was traveling through Russia. I don't know what they talked about, but they met. He got back to the US, gave a lecture tour, and then did another 3-year round-the-world trip. So finally, he gets back to the US in the late 20s and does a lecture tour that's massively successful all over the country before finally settling in LA at the end of the 20s and getting involved in the local Esperanto movement there, and then eventually running for office, as I mentioned. Now, as I mentioned, he was in office until 1949. He finally passed away in 1954. Which brings us back to Upton. So, as I mentioned, so far I've only found the mentions about Upton and Esperanto in that 1910, 1911 period, or that was what I had initially found. And at first I thought, okay, maybe it was just something he was interested in early on, or he mentioned a few times and he moved on from. However, I've found more mentions of Upton and Esperanto from later in his life. So it seems that Sinclair had not forgotten about Esperanto, and that he was probably still actively supporting and thinking about it, even if he may not have been actively engaged with it directly. So in 1966, he was one of the signatories on a petition to the United Nations, asking them to give additional recognition to Esperanto. And then in 1968, he actually sent greetings to the convention of the Esperanto League for North America, which is the prior name for Esperanto-USA. Apparently, the greetings were sent, quote, through his nephew. This is according to the Elna Bulletin from the time, which I assume means that his nephew was there in person to give the greetings. So to me, that's a pretty strong implication that this was still something that Sinclair thought about quite actively and in high regard, if he actually asked his nephew to go in person to give greetings. So all that being said, I don't know yet whether Upton ever truly followed through on his promise to study Esperanto or learn Esperanto, or how familiar he may become. But I do think it's safe to say that he had a much more intimate and long-term engagement with Esperanto and Esperantists than almost any other major American author. And finally, he passed away shortly after the ELNA convention. He passed away in 1968, and he had a loving tribute in the Universala Esperanto-Asociación's Esperanto magazine about his life. So that's what I have so far on the connections between Upton Sinclair and Esperanto. I do plan to research this more when I can get into some of the archives, which I want to dig into more of the archives around Parley Barker Christensen. I'm happy to take any questions or open up for discussion about either of these gentlemen that I've presented on tonight.
I got a question, Brandon. The research that you've collected, where have you found these resources? I've done some research on some other things myself, and I always start with the internet. And it seems the more time passes, the more constrained Google searches become, trying to be, feeding local information and stuff. And a lot of these archives aren't necessarily online. So what archives are you getting this information, and how are you accessing it?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That's a really good question. It's been interesting for me as I've started researching this. I haven't kind of been even adjacent to academia for quite a while, so a lot of things that I think for academics are kind of second nature for research methods are not really part of my day to day. And then of course travel and things like that are harder nowadays, so it's a little harder to visit archives in person and that kind of thing. So for what I've been able to find so far, as I mentioned, the New York Times was one resource. The archive of ELNA bulletins and America Esperantisto and other kind of national American Esperanto bulletins on Esperanto-USA's website has been a really useful resource. So on there, I've been able to search for both Upton Sinclair and Parley Barker Christensen. For Christensen, a few resources were sent to me. I actually had I mentioned it to Bridget O'Keefe, who will be presenting tomorrow, because I had found this mention that Christensen traveled to Russia in 1920 and met Lenin there. So I thought, oh, this could be, interesting if she's seen mention of him. So she hadn't previously, but she sent me some articles that she found while searching kind of in more academic databases. And then he's also mentioned in a couple of different kind of pamphlets by different folks in the labor movement that I've been able to find. So yeah, I think there's a problem that I ran into, which is that I tend to focus on just looking for things online, and I find what I can find online, and I don't have a background of going deeper than that. That I think is became a limitation that I'm trying to overcome with this research.
Jane has a question.
Yeah, a comment about Christensen, especially, and to some extent about Sinclair, because Christensen was in Los Angeles and was on the LA City Council. I imagine the LA Central Library might be a good place to look for archives, and maybe other places around town, maybe one of the local universities would have materials. I'm in LA, so maybe I could help.
That's awesome. Thank you. I would love that. I'm hoping to get to California later this year and see if I can find anything there. So I'd love to work with you on that. yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I have to wonder how.
Bonege.
I have to wonder whether there might be something also like at the library at UCLA or USC and the other colleges in the area.
Yes, very possible. Um, and maybe even City Hall maintain some kind of archive. They should have something.
Yeah, that was my next question. Maybe you can find out, Jane, where the Los Angeles County of Los Angeles keeps its archives. They, whether they've donated them or whether they store them in a an archive facility or what they do with them.
Yeah, that shouldn't be too hard to find out, I would hope. And given how many universities there are in the area, I wouldn't be surprised if one of them had this.
Yeah, there's two more very interesting Esperantists that I found from LA in the 30s that I hope to do more research on, which were Myrtle Douglas and Forrest Ackerman. So Forrest Ackerman is a well-known person in the science fiction world.
Mm-hmm.
Myrtle Douglas should be better known, but she's essentially the inventor of cosplay. And they met in an Esperanto class in the 1930s in LA. And Myrtle Douglas had a science fiction fanzine, the first ever science fiction fanzine, um, and uh, and apparently had a bunch of information about Esperanto in it.
So Brandon, do you know if that class was one taught by Christensen?
From the mention I've seen, it doesn't look like it was.
Okay.
Yeah, so I haven't found a direct connection between Christensen and Douglas
Mm-hmm.
or Ackerman,
Yeah.
Yeah.
or for that
Well,
matter, yeah.
Yeah.
A friend of mine is deeply involved with the LA Science Fantasy Society. And if there's anything to be known about Forrest Ackerman, he or some of the other old-time members would be the people to know now.
Yeah, and I can tell you that Forrest Ackerman stayed with Esperanto through his entire life, as far as I know. I met him in like 1986, 1988, somewhere in through there at a World Science Fiction Convention where we had a working group on Esperanto one day, and it was a great experience.
Yeah, I was in contact with him till shortly before he lost the mansion, and he was an Esperantist all the way to the end.
Yeah, I would. I'm not sure if I'm the right person to research this. I'm happy to do it, but also if others want to research about Ackerman and Myrtle Douglas and their connections to Esperanto, I think it could be really fascinating. Myrtle Douglas has gotten some interesting press in the last couple of years as this kind of forgotten predecessor of like feminist science fiction culture and cosplay and things like that. So I think she was recently, a couple years ago, she was acknowledged as like the grandmother of cosplay by the World Costuming Society or something like that, and they wrote about her in their bulletin. So I think we should do something similar and say, hey, this woman was writing about Esperanto and science fiction before anybody else. And same with Ackerman, he's a huge figure, so we should definitely write about him.
Brandon, the Lilly Library at Indiana University in Bloomington has a very large collection of Upton Sinclair papers. And a large part of that is searchable online. And apparently it has thousands and thousands of letters of his correspondence with other authors and other people. So you may be able to find actually him discussing Esperanto in his letters.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I'm looking at some of the comments now, and I noticed that someone mentions that in his autobiography, Sinclair mentions that he was learning both Esperanto and Italian, but gave up Esperanto in favor of Italian. And I'm also seeing that there were some comments about Forrest Ackerman. I think before I mentioned him, wondering if there's a connection between Ackerman and Christensen.
if there's any research that is uncovered that is you would consider fundamental to the early history of Esperanto in the United States, we need to be sure to keep in mind that Hispanic Studies Foundation is trying to capture that information, get documents, letters, books, pamphlets, whatever can be acquired, because Esperanto Studies Foundation is trying to manage the archiving of historical information.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that I've thought about, is that they may be able to point towards, meeting minutes and things like that from LA in the 30s that might show who was at, which people were at the same meetings and things like that could give some interesting connections. Of course, there's another prominent Esperantist from LA in the 30s, which is Vilcio Harman. He learned Esperanto in LA in the 30s and then went on to, teach it on ships in the Pacific during World War II before he became a major figure in ELNA. So I'm not sure if what his connection may or may not be with any of these figures, but that's another rabbit hole I would like to dive down.
Yeah.
Yes.
Vilcho invited Fourier Ackerman to our Esperanto meetings, and he came a few times. So they were clearly connected.
And a library employee here, if you live in a bigger town, chances are there's a part of your library system called special collections. Make friends with whoever is in charge of that, because you may ask them, hey, do you have any materials about something called Esperanto? And they'll blow up your inbox with things that you had no clue existed.
Mhm.
It's a really good tip.
If I might make a suggestion, I don't have a shirt on, so I'm going to stay hidden. As far as the academic search part, you're absolutely right about Google narrowing searches, but your first search you might try when you go out again is looking for free academic search sites, which will provide you with and there are a number of them out there that will provide you with a whole lot of information that you will never find on Google. So I would start my next expedition with looking for alternate search sites. And again, specifically in this case, probably academic search sites.
Yeah, the problem is that mostly you have to pay, and a lot of academics use Google Scholar, which is very useful. But the other thing is that because Google does a lot of personalization, which is sometimes good, sometimes not, you can sometimes get more interesting results in DuckDuckGo.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that most libraries do this. The King County library system has subscriptions to an awful lot of specialized databases that
Yes.
otherwise you would have to pay for.
Mhm.
And you can get to them for the price of a library card, which is free.
Yes, some of them, and if you're friends with somebody at the university, present company included, then they should have access to a lot of things.
These are really interesting ideas. This is reminding me of something. I don't know how many folks here are familiar with Xavi Alcalde. He's an Esperantist in Barcelona, and he does a lot of research on Esperantists in Spain over different periods. And one thing that I've thought about sometimes is like our own history is not as well documented as it is in other countries. And he's talked about, the importance of researching your kind of rank and file Esperantists from your area, from your city, or from your country, to kind of fill out that history. So I think that, you know, I keep coming across these interesting characters in the history of American Esperantism that that could be interesting to research. So hopefully we all have some good tips that we can follow. And I'd be interested in continuing that conversation. Has anyone else done like research on figures from our American Esperanto past?
This is extremely minimal, but there's a fellow whose name you may recognize called Richard Henry Gorgian, who, if you know him at all, you probably know him as the person who translated La Unua Libro into English, the version that was used after the first version that Zamenhof um, commissioned turned out to be a complete dud. But he passed through the state of Washington at one point, and I've only found a little bit of a mention on Wikipedia about that, and I'd be interested in finding out exactly why it was that he decided he needed to come to East Sound on his way to Alaska, where he became a recognized expert in languages of the Aleut. But yeah, he's a very interesting character. As far as I can tell, he was the first English-speaking Esperantist. He was the first American Esperantist. He just, you know, all kinds of firsts, and I don't know if anybody really knows much about him.
That is super interesting. Yeah, that would be a really fascinating subject to research. Ralph mentioned in the chat that he's done a lot of research on African American Esperantists as well as the 1910 Universal Congreso. So that's and his, I believe a lot of his research is on his website, perhaps all of it. I see Patricia Egan raised her hand.
So I was just going to say,
Pat, you muted yourself.
okay, I meant to lower my hand, and instead I unmuted myself. So I just a couple weeks ago received an email from Kathy Schultz's nephew, Frank Lanzone, and we were just all kids together learning Esperanto, but Frank did everything with Kathy and Bill. I mean, they didn't have children, but so Frank was sort of their nephew that went around to everything. I think when he was 17 years old, they somehow or another had him president of either Sparrow or something. You know? But he's not I mean, I don't think his fluency would be pretty rusty at this point, but he would know a lot. And he's the president of the public radio station in San Luis Obispo. I mean, there would be a source. You know, he's a few years older than I am, and I'm almost 70. So he's probably, I don't know, 74. But it's always good to, you know, sort of get these oral histories captured before, you know, before you forget and while people are still available. It's just a thought. But I think Frank Lanzone would be a great person to interview. Certainly for the Schultz's era.
That's a great idea. I find myself constantly wishing that I had you know, done interviews with Vilche Harmon before he passed. Are you able to interview? Like, is that something that'd be accessible to you?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of the people I knew are now passed away. I mean, Peg Barkley and Doris Fallon and Gigi Harabaju. I have recollections of some stories that they told me. I'd have to really go dig through boxes of old papers to see if there's anything else. But I really think Frank would be a treasure trove. because he would have gone back to the Schultz's activity probably in the early 60s at least, which is, we had a class. And so that's how we all knew each other. It's just, you know, it's just another person, another resource that you might like to check into.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage you if you have the opportunity to interview him, that would be awesome.
No, I can get to him. But somebody else should be with, I mean, I don't know what to ask him. You know, we were all we'll do is sit and you know, reminisce about, you know, oh, do you remember this and remember that, and how, you know, after the Sparrow meetings, we used to go here and there. You know, it wouldn't be substantive. I think somebody who's really a professional or more experienced at oral history would be, would sort of be better. You know, you can prepare so that you make sure you capture a lot of information, but there's a real skill to being able to conduct a quality interview. And I don't know if I have that skill, you know. It's just a thought.
Well, we were right at 8:44 and we're supposed to wrap up at 8:45. So I'm gonna go ahead and you know, stop the recording. And we still have 15 minutes that we can chat before the Afer Concido. So thank you everyone for participating tonight. I really enjoyed the kind of freewheeling discussion after the presentation, and I'm hopeful that many of us will be able to follow up on some of these threads. I know I saw one person mention researching Myrtle Douglas. Please hit me up in the Discord, you know, or message me in the Discord, because that's a subject I've started to look into. So I'd love to collaborate about that. It'd be great if we can write something about Myrtle Douglas or Freddie Ackerman for the Usona Esperantisto, and I'd love to collaborate on that. All right, I'll go ahead and stop recording now.